From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene announces she'll soon trigger a vote to oust Speaker Mike Johnson, as Democrats say they're ready to help block that motion. Plus, the New York Police Department retakes the Columbia University campus, arresting busloads of anti-Israel protesters in the process. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board members Kate Batchelder-Odell and Colin Levy. The last time that a backbench Republican brought up a motion to vacate the chair, as it's called, it led to the firing of Speaker Kevin McCarthy and then weeks of GOP chaos that most in Congress do not want to repeat. But Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene is furious that the House passed a bill with military aid to Ukraine especially. She has been threatening to punish Speaker Johnson by bringing up another motion to vacate. And this morning, on Wednesday, she pledged that she will pull the trigger on it next week. Here is a bit of what she had to say.
Now we have Hakeem Jeffries and the Democrats coming out, embracing Mike Johnson with a warm hug and a big, wet, sloppy kiss. And they are ready they have endorsed him. They are ready to support him as Speaker. They want to keep it going, keep the band together. Why? Because Mike Johnson is giving them everything they want. I think every member of Congress needs to take that vote and let the chips fall where they may. And so next week, I am going to be calling this motion to vacate.
What Marjorie Taylor Greene is referring to there is that this maneuver seems like it will probably go nowhere after House Democratic leaders announced on Tuesday that they will lend votes to block her motion. Here is a part of the statement from Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, the whip Catherine Clark, and the caucus chair Pete Aguilar. They said, "We will vote to table Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene's motion to vacate the chair. If she invokes the motion, it will not succeed." And then here is a bit more from Mr. Aguilar.
Look, I'm not going to try to get in the head of Marjorie Taylor Greene. I don't know what goes on in there. It's her right to bring that up. The Republican rules that she voted for, that we voted against, allow any single member to bring this proposal up. She is a legislative arsonist, and she is holding the gas tank. And Kevin McCarthy allowed that to happen. That's not lost on anybody. What we are saying is we don't need to be a part of that.
Kate, what do you make of this maneuver by Marjorie Taylor Greene, and how do you expect it to play out?
Well, so I do think it's important to go back, and it's true that Kevin McCarthy, as the price of getting the Speaker's job in the first place, had to lower the threshold for these motions to vacate the chair to a single member. And that was always going to be a difficult and untenable way to govern if any one person in a very thin majority wields an assassin's veto. So that is what's happened. And I think now there was some discussion while the aid bill moved a couple weeks ago for Mike Johnson to simply use the opportunity to change the rule and raise the threshold again so that any one person couldn't take the entire House hostage that way. He declined to do that, didn't think it would command majority Republican support. But now we are in this ugly spectacle where Greene is vowing to go forward. But I think Greene is in a very precarious, bad spot, no matter what she's saying, and even if she's claiming that Mike Johnson is a Democrat speaker. Because a person who is weakening Mike Johnson and forcing him to rely on Democrats' votes is her. She's the one that's putting the GOP majority at risk of being unable to function because she has, one, no plan of who would follow Mike Johnson. If you remember, Steve Scalise and Jim Jordan, both credible candidates for the speakership, couldn't command a majority of the conference to win the post. The conference eventually came up with Mike Johnson. But there's no one now who could replace him, and the end of Johnson would basically mean the end of the functioning of the Republican House for the duration of the year. But the reason I think that Greene's in a bad spot is because Trump, behind the scenes, is working to get Greene to stand down. This is not supported by him. It doesn't appear so, at least. And secondly, the outrage over the Ukraine bill in the weeks following the vote has been much more muted than I think Greene predicted. And so this is not turning into the kind of momentum that she had hoped, where she would get more Republicans on her side from outrage from the base. It just simply hasn't materialized. So she may now call a vote and try to humiliate the speaker, and it will come to nothing, which would be unfortunate, but it also will just fail and humiliate herself in the process as well. So that's where things stand, doomed to fail. Hopefully somebody will talk her out of it, but I wouldn't count on it.
But the optimistic case is, does this perhaps defang the threat? This has been a threat that has been hanging over Mike Johnson his whole speakership. It has been a threat that was hanging over Speaker Kevin McCarthy before him. And so if she now triggers the motion and it fails, does that not give Speaker Johnson a little more leeway, a little more freedom to execute the kind of agenda that he thinks is good for the country? And another thing that I would make a distinction on here is that there are a few ways that Democrats could help him survive this motion. One obvious one is just to vote for Speaker Johnson, but they aren't going to do that. And Speaker Johnson, I don't think, would want them to do that. He wouldn't want to be a speaker elected with Democratic votes. But what they're talking about doing is something different. They're talking about voting with other Republicans to table this motion. And so they are not embracing Speaker Johnson. The Democratic legislators are not saying we want Speaker Johnson to be the Speaker of the House. They are merely saying that we don't think it is good for the House or good for the country to go down this road of dethroning the Speaker again right now in the middle of this session, because we have real business to get to, including the next year's budget. And I think there's a distinction there that Marjorie Taylor Greene is trying deliberately to erase, Kate, when she says that, Speaker Johnson will then be the Democratic Speaker of the House.
Right. I mean, the Democrats said that they were basically deciding that they didn't want to let Marjorie Greene dictate the calendar and the schedule of the House, which I think is appropriate. I mean, the Democrats were asked questions like, how could you support Mike Johnson, who we think is an election denier, and why didn't you extract a higher price, even though Johnson had worked with them to get the aid bill through, which was a huge priority for President Biden. You're right to make that distinction that they have merely decided that it's important for the House to continue to function throughout the rest of the year. And this curiosity of lowering the threshold for who can throw out the Speaker and under what circumstances has just made the House much harder to govern. So I agree that that's an important distinction. But I think Johnson also has been giving good answers about this question at his weekly press conference. Said, well, I am also the Speaker of the whole House, and I am a conservative philosophically, and that's how I govern. But I think what the public wants is for the House to function, that it's a serious moment for the country, and that there's plenty of work to do, including trying to fund the government. I mean, the budget cycle only recently finished halfway through the fiscal year, and now the House has to work on appropriations bills for every agency, again, coming into the fall. So they have real work to do. And they also, again, could be Republicans, if they were to hang together, could be using the opportunity to make the case to the public to expand their majority in the fall. That also should be a huge Republican priority at this point. I mean, if you think about it, we'll talk more in a minute about what's been going on at Columbia, but the Democrats are having a rough political week as campuses emerge in protests that are sometimes downright anti-Semitic and defending the terrorist group Hamas. This is something that Republicans are talking about and trying to point out as a vulnerability for the Biden administration. And instead, it's been completely sideshowed by this new round of antics in the House. So again, I think there is an opportunity here for the Republican conference to continue to function and show that they want to grow their majority in the fall, not shrink it, which is ultimately what Marjorie Greene and her friends want to do.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. The other part of the argument that Marjorie Taylor Greene is making that I find remarkable, Colin, is she's talking about the uniparty. And when she gave her remarks, she had a placard in front of her that called Mike Johnson the uniparty speaker. And again, I understand why she thinks it's in her interest to say that. I just don't recognize the political landscape that she claims to be describing. It seems to me that political polarization in the country is very high, and there are enormous disagreements between Republicans and Democrats, between Mike Johnson and Hakeem Jeffries, just to pick a few: abortion, spending, taxes, the border. The agendas that those two men have are almost polar opposites. Her frustration seems to be more with the fact that we have divided government. And so we have a Republican House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic president. And so any sort of legislation that comes out of Congress right now is by definition a compromise, which is unsatisfying to both sides. But this whole business about we have a uniparty and this is a uniparty speakership, I think is not reality.
No, that's right. I mean, look, this is the basic work of being a legislator, Kyle. I think when you look at Marjorie Taylor Greene, there's just such an incredible level of narcissism at work when you have people like her and some of these other Republican members of the House who are tying up the proceedings really just in an effort to get themselves in the headlines. The idea that she needs to take out any speaker that cuts a deal with Democrats is not a form of governing. I mean, that's just a log rolling exercise. And it is also, as Kate was saying, a major missed opportunity for Republicans right now because you have so much dysfunction and so much trouble in the Democratic Party right now, so much splintering on the left over foreign policy and specifically over Israel's war on Hamas and the general issue of anti-Semitism on campus that we're seeing play out. This is a moment when Republicans could be very effectively the adults in the room and provide voters with a counterpoint of rational and productive leadership. And instead, you have this sort of frothing mass that is really just a gift to Democrats and to Hakeem Jeffries, who can just sit back and watch. It's the definition of an unforced error. What I really hope is that there will be some reckoning order at some point. You know, I did see that Florida Representative Matt Gaetz is going to have a primary challenger, and I think it's 4 of the 6 other Republicans who voted for McCarthy's ouster, who are up for re-election, are also facing primary fights. So, you know, I hope this is a temporary situation.
My last thought on this, Kate, is you mentioned that Speaker Johnson had been asked in recent weeks whether it was worth going ahead and amending those rules to raise the threshold so that only one person could no longer make a motion to vacate the chair. And my recollection is that he said he thought that at this point, in the middle of this session, it would only inflame things to go down that road. But it does seem to me that another element of potential backfire here for Marjorie Taylor Greene is the more times that this motion to vacate is discussed and threatened and then triggered and then blows up, it seems to be the more determined the next GOP majority will be to change that rule if we have a Republican House after the November elections, or if not in future years. I think the next person who is in the position that Kevin McCarthy was in, trying to get the votes for a majority to get the speaker's gavel, it seems to me that they will learn the lesson here and say, no way, no how should that threshold be one person to bring up this motion.
Absolutely. I think that lesson certainly has been absorbed at this point. And in retrospect, Johnson may end up wishing that he had tried to change the rules midway through anyway. I think the other rule that I'd add to that is that if you recall, during the McCarthy days, trying to win the gavel, he also put 3 sort of hard-wing conservatives on the Rules Committee. They insisted on spots on the Rules Committee because the Rules Committee is so influential in deciding what bills can come to the floor. And the practical result of that has been that these members have simply just shut down the Rules Committee. And now nothing can move through on the committee. And instead, Johnson has to move everything to the floor that he wants to pass under a suspension of the rules that requires a 2/3 majority. So he can only pass things that command a significant number of Democratic votes. So I think that lesson has been learned too. And again, what a pity, because these members have been claiming that they would use these positions of power to extract more fiscal discipline in spending bills, to accomplish conservative priorities. And they've delivered absolutely none of that. It's just been a pure obstruction play that has made Democrats have more influence on what gets to the floor. So I think it has backfired. I'd also add, too, that just on the pure politics of this, before we wrap up, that Greene is in a precarious spot if Trump were to turn on her. I think some of these House members who have come to prominence in Trump's orbit think that they can just continue the social media, the fundraising, the outrage machine, and live off that a long time. But Trump is sui generis for a lot of reasons, including the ways the Democrats have attacked him with lawfare. And his connection with his voters is different. And I think that Greene could really risk getting on the outside of the Trump world that has made her famous. So I would not assume, as any of these backbenchers, that you could go around Trump and who doesn't want Johnson thrown out and doesn't want the chaos in the House for the next 3 weeks and still have any influence in his orbit or in national Republican politics generally. So I think self-marginalization is definitely part of what some of this crowd has been trying to accomplish, but it could really backfire and diminish their prospects in the end.
Let's turn to the latest in the campus protests over Gaza. Overnight, the New York Police Department, the NYPD, took back Hamilton Hall, which had been taken over by protesters at Columbia University who barricaded themselves inside. The police seem to have used a kind of a SWAT truck with a bridge kind of thing on top of it. I'm looking at photos in the New York Post to go up and get in through a window. This is a piece of the statement from Columbia President Manoush Shafiq, because my first responsibility is safety. With the support of the university's trustees, I made the decision to ask the New York City Police Department to intervene to end the occupation of Hamilton Hall and dismantle the main encampment along with a new, smaller encampment. She said it's going to take time to heal, but I know we can do that together. I hope that we can use the weeks ahead to restore calm, allow students to complete their academic work, and honor their achievements at commencement. Let's listen also to a clip of New York Mayor Eric Adams on CBS explaining why the NYPD took action.
We did not take this action lightly, and once the Columbia University team and leadership in their letter acknowledging that outside agitators were on their campus grounds, we looked at our intel and information. I was briefed by the intelligence division, and they were able to identify organizations and individuals who were not students but were professional agitators. And we realized after the breaking into Hamilton Hall, some of the tactics, some of the methods, these are clearly being used across the globe. And we understood that how really dangerous this situation had become.
Colin, what do you make of that? I guess we are still waiting to see the list of those protesters who were taken away. How many among them were students? And if not, who else was there? But is this the kind of action that Columbia needed to take? And what do you make of the president's request for calm as we get toward commencement?
Kyle, on several of those points, I mean, I think this definitely needed to happen. I don't think anyone doubts that at this point. And it will be interesting to see if some of these were professional agitators. I don't think it should surprise anyone, least of all the students at this point, that they've been used on many levels by people with a larger political agenda who are delighted to see universities become these sort of chaotic scenes right as they're going into graduation. But I think the biggest lesson that we need to take from what we've been witnessing on the Columbia campus is how important it is for schools to set clear rules about speech for their students, because as much as there may have been some professional influence here, a lot of the kids that were out there were Columbia students. And I think what happens to them, over the coming 4, 5, 6, 10 years is really the game that we're looking at now. I think we've been in an environment over the past 10 years or so, maybe longer, where political speech on campus was really not celebrated. You had a lot of situations where there was so little conservative speech on campus coming from the professoriate, for sure, or from the student body, that most of the conservative thought was coming in the form of outside visiting speakers who were invited by student groups, and speakers as established as federal judges, who were appointed by Republican presidents, were enough to send a progressive student body into just a frenzy of frustration. And, we know how common it's been to see speakers who are heckled and shouted down. And on some level, when undergraduates are trying to shout down the speech of a federal judge, they think of themselves as the little guys in this situation. And the response to them from university administrators about that sort of, speech that crosses into inappropriate conduct and violence really was tolerated, because it was in this situation where they were almost treating the speakers as the authority figures, and their protest to therefore somehow be a form of righteous pushback against an established oppressor, to borrow the language of academia. And so I think, within that belief in the righteousness of shouting down authority, there's this lack of the sense of a need for self-restraint, or the need to modulate words or messages in a way that approaches the kind of civil dialogue that colleges have always at least ascribed to in theory. And there's no question that has crossed into what we've seen in the protests, to the violent words, the anti-Semitic language, and the really truly intimidating environment that has begun to govern on these campuses.